If I say yes, it might be the end of me? That's what Celia whispered to her sister just moments before the wedding. Then she vanished. No one saw her leave. No one heard a scream. For 8 long years, there were no answers. Until a storm shattered the chapel walls and revealed what the vines had been hiding all along. The sun broke gently over the rolling hills of Larkspur Hollow, brushing warm light across the whitewashed chapel that had stood for more than a century. Dew still clung to the chapel's stained glass, and beyond the fields, the lake shimmered with early morning stillness. Inside the nearby Rosebriar Inn, the air buzzed with anticipation. Celia Wren, 24, stood in front of the tall arched mirror of room 7, barefoot and radiant. The delicate lace of her wedding gown clung to her like a second skin, ethereal and timeless. She tilted her head, examining the way the fabric fell along her hips, then glanced at her reflection in Sure. Something in her eyes was off, tired, anxious. "Don't do that," her sister June said softly, perched on the arm of a nearby chair. "Don't start doubting now. You look beautiful." Celia forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her. "Eyes. It's not the dress." June tilted her head. "Then what is it?" "I had a dream last night," Celia said, smoothing the veil. "The chapel was full of people, but no one was facing me. Not even Aaron. They all had their backs. Turned, I was walking down the aisle alone." June rose, crossing to her. "That's just nerves." Celia blinked at herself. "Maybe." Later that morning, Aaron Calloway arrived at the inn, holding a bouquet of white peonies. He kissed Celia's forehead with practiced tenderness. "Nervous?" he asked, voice a little too cheerful. His fingers were cold. She nodded. "You?" He hesitated. "No, just, thinking about the guest list. Your mom said there's still an issue with the seating chart." June, who lingered behind them in the foyer, watched the exchange closely. Something about Aaron felt wrong. Not new, just sharpened today. There had always been a subtle control in his gestures, in the way Celia spoke more softly around him. Aaron turned to June with his usual politician's smile. "Mind if I steal your sister for a minute?" June shrugged. "She's all yours." He took Celia's hand and led her outside into the garden. From the hallway window, June could see the outline of them talking, his gestures tight, hers defensive. He touched her chin. She looked away. Celia returned to the room 15 minutes later, pale and distracted. "I need to take a walk," she said, slipping into her flats. "Want company?" June offered. "No, just air." She never mentioned what Aaron had said. By early afternoon, the rehearsal went on without incident. The florist arrived late, the band rehearsed awkwardly, and the wedding planner seemed perpetually 5 minutes behind. Still, everyone chalked it up to the usual chaos before a ceremony. By evening, Celia had disappeared. She was last seen at 5:47 p.m. by the hairstylist, who said Celia had gone back to her suite to change before dinner. Her phone was on the dresser. Her bouquet lay untouched. The wedding gown hung on its hanger like a ghost waiting to be inhabited. The bridal suite door was unlocked. No signs of struggle. No note, nothing. Police were called just after sunset. The entire inn was swept. Guests were questioned. Aaron gave his statement calmly. "She seemed a little tense earlier, but nothing alarming. I assume she needed space." June, however, panicked. "She wouldn't leave without saying something to me," she insisted to the officers. "She was scared this morning. She told me something was off." She felt something. "Felt what?" asked the deputy. June swallowed. "Like she wasn't going to make it to the wedding." Outside, search dogs combed the forest trails behind. The chapel, drones flew over the lake. Locals lit candles along the chapel gate. But Celia had vanished into the soft evening air, leaving behind only silence and Tulle. Aaron did not cry in front of the police. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the chapel doors open and shut again and again. When asked if they'd had any fights, he shrugged. "She was anxious, that's all, but who wouldn't be? It's a big day." At midnight, a deputy found one of Celia's ballet flats in the garden behind the chapel. No footprints. No drag marks, just the shoe upright clean. The wedding was canceled. Guests returned home in disbelief. The press began circling Larkspur Hollow like vultures. Runaway bride, the headlines screamed. Mystery at the chapel. But June knew better. Her sister wasn't someone who ran. She was someone who endured, who stayed, who overthought everything before she acted. There had been no getaway car, no hidden bags, no whispers of another man, just Celia, gone, 8 years later. The gown still hung in the police evidence locker, wrapped in plastic like a relic from a story no one understood. A ghost dress waiting for its bride, and then, one night, the storm came. After Celia vanished, the police boxed up her belongings from the Rosebriar Inn, her dress, her bouquet, even her phone charger. But they missed something hidden inside the lining of her floral makeup bag. June found it weeks later while packing up her sister's apartment. A small leather-bound journal. Edges worn from use. The first few pages were filled with lists, wedding songs, floral arrangements, guest names. But as the entries moved closer to the date, the tone shifted. July 18th. Sometimes I look at Aaron and feel like I'm watching a stranger wear the face of someone I used to know. July 27th. The dream came again. I was locked inside the chapel. I could hear my name, but no one came. June had read those words 100 times. She tried to show the police, but they brushed it off, said it sounded like anxiety. Cold feet, they called it, but June knew better. One afternoon, she confronted Aaron directly. They stood in the old bakery their families used to frequent as kids. The place still smelled like cinnamon and butter, a smell too warm for the coldness between them. You heard her, June said. Aaron didn't flinch. You're grieving, June. You're trying to make sense of something senseless. She was scared of you. She told me that morning. He cut her off. Then why did she agree to marry me? June's voice cracked. Maybe because she thought she had no choice. Aaron leaned in, too close. Are you hearing yourself? You sound paranoid, obsessed. She left in tears. No one else had dared question him. Everyone loved Aaron Calloway. Star quarterback, town golden boy, family, money, perfect smile. Celia had been his prize, but what the town didn't know was that perfect smiles can rot from the inside. Back in high school, he had isolated her slowly, subtly, from friends, from dance, from her own instincts. June had watched it happen in real time, but when she tried to intervene, Celia had shut down. She loves me, she once said. It's just complicated. June hated that word. Complicated was the bruise Celia had blamed on tripping in the garden. Complicated was the way she stammered when asked about Aaron's temper. Complicated was the mirror she'd refused to look into the morning of the wedding after the disappearance. June kept digging. She found an old phone Celia had hidden in her drawer. On it, dozens of deleted voicemails. Most were from Aaron. You can't keep shutting me out, Cell. You think this is a game? You promised me. Don't start running. Now, you know I can't let you walk away. But none of that was enough for the police. They had no body. No signs of violence. Just an empty room and a missing bride. She could have left on her own, one detective said. She's an adult. June slammed Celia's journal down. No one runs away in their wedding dress. They told her she was grieving. Told her she was projecting. Told her to move on. So she stopped talking to them. She started visiting the chapel alone, usually at dusk. The air around it always felt colder, the stained glass darkened by time and mildew. One evening, she stood behind the pulpit, facing the aisle, and imagined Celia walking toward her, lace trailing. Eyes wide, she saw something, June whispered into the silence. Something that scared her enough to run or enough to freeze. Sometimes she would sit in the empty pews and replay everything, every hesitation, every half-smile, every moment her sister had tried to warn her without using the words. Celia had screamed, but only inside her own mind. Her silence had been her cage, and the chapel had been her coffin, back home. June pinned photocopied pages of the journal to her bedroom wall. Notes, maps, the florist's witness statement. Even the heel they'd found behind the chapel, her own version of a crime board. A puzzle that didn't make sense until the storms came, the hurricane that battered. Larkspur Hollow 8 years later was like nothing the town had seen. trees uprooted, roofs ripped away. Mudslides along the chapel hill, and behind the collapsing altar wall something that should have never been buried, the storm unearthed more than soil and stone. It reopened memories, some buried, some willfully forgotten. The chapel's caretaker, an old man named Martin Shaw, was one of the first to come forward after the storm damaged the building. He'd kept mostly to himself over the years, tending to the overgrown grounds and restoring stained glass no one ever came to see anymore. But now, with reporters swarming and rumors stirring, he made a quiet visit to the sheriff's office with the name Margot Hill, the wedding florist. "She said something to me once," Martin mumbled, "but I didn't take it seriously. Maybe now I should." Margot was living 3 towns over by then, retired, arthritic, and forgetful in patches, but not about that night. June drove out to meet her personally, desperate to speak with someone who still remembered Celia as more than a headline. They sat together in Margot's sunroom, tea untouched, rain tapping gently against the windows. She looked lost. Margot said, her fingers trembling as she held an old photograph from the rehearsal. "Celia, that night before the wedding. I was packing up the last of the Lila around 9 when I saw her in the vestibule." June leaned forward. "Was Aaron with her?" Margot shook her head slowly. "No, it wasn't Aaron." She closed her eyes as if replaying the scene behind her eyelids. There was a man, tall, wearing a long coat and a hat, wide-brimmed like something out of an old noir film. I only saw him from behind at first, but his body language, it was tense. He grabbed her wrist. Not violently, but firm. She tried to pull away. "I couldn't hear everything, just enough to know," she said. "You told me this was over." And he said, "You don't get to decide that." June's stomach turned. "Did you tell the police?" "I did," Margot whispered. "But later, when I asked about the chapel cameras, they said the footage from that wing wasn't working." "I thought maybe I imagined it." "You didn't," June said. "You couldn't have." The chapel's vestibule had been one of the few areas equipped with security cameras. June remembered that clearly the planner had insisted on it after a recent break-in. But the police report from 2017 stated the hard drive was inoperable, and that the memory card for that particular camera had been misplaced. Too convenient. June left Margot's house with a copy of her original statement never followed up on, never acknowledged in court filings. It had been buried like everything else. The description of the man burned in her brain. Tall, long coat, wide-brimmed hat. Not Aaron, someone else. But why had no one else seen him? Back in Larkspur Hollow, she began asking around quietly at first. At the bakery, the inn, the nearby shops. A few elderly guests who had attended the wedding rehearsal. Vaguely remembered a stranger walking through the chapel garden that evening. "Out of place," one said. "Didn't seem like a guest." But no name, no clear face. Just the same image, coat, hat, dark presence. June began sketching it in her journal, a silhouette. Always in the corner. Always watching. Then came the shock. June visited the local archive, hoping to retrieve a backup of the chapel's blueprints. Instead, she stumbled across an old ledger from the church's founding years. On the final page, tucked between 2 fading newspaper clippings, was a photograph of a wedding in the 1940s. At the edge of the frame unmistakable, a man in a wide-brimmed hat. Of course, it couldn't be the same person. But the coincidence was haunting. As if that silhouette had lived in the chapel longer than anyone realized, obsessed, June returned to the chapel. The wind had broken one of the back windows, allowing her inside. The air smelled of mildew, ash, and decay. She walked slowly down the main aisle, flashlight in hand. She stopped at the vestibule. The paint was peeling. The old security camera hung limply, wires exposed. Beneath it, carved faintly into the baseboard, was a word, "Mine," scratched in, not written. Deep enough to feel with her fingertips, June's heart pounded. She turned toward the door, and for a brief second in the broken mirror on the vestibule wall, she saw movement, a figure, a shadow in a long coat, but when she spun around, nothing. Just her own reflection, pale and shaking, back at her apartment. She pulled out Celia's journal again. There, buried between 2 mundane entries, was something she had missed before. He came to the chapel again last night. Said he still loved me, said he'd wait behind the glass until I said yes. It wasn't Aaron. It had never been just Aaron. The morning after the wedding that never happened. The Rosebriar Inn was silent, rooms that had once overflowed with laughter and clinking. Champagne glasses now echoed with low murmurs and whispered questions. Bridesmaids packed their gowns with trembling hands. The caterers didn't return. The pastor canceled all services for the week. And outside, the media trucks arrived like wolves. By noon, Celia's face was on every local news channel. Her bridal photo frozen mid-smile, as if mocking the tragedy that had swallowed her whole. The caption beneath read, "Runaway bride," or something more sinister. Aaron Calloway stood on the chapel steps that evening, flanked by his lawyer and a few grim-faced relatives. Flashbulbs popped as he stepped forward to the microphones. "I don't know where Celia is," he said, voice tight with grief. "All I know is that I love her, and I just want her to come home." He paused, his lip trembled. He looked to the sky like he might cry, and then he did, right on cue. June watched from the crowd. Her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't believe it. Not the performance, not the tears, not the perfectly rehearsed devastation. What the cameras didn't see was that Aaron had refused a second interview with the police. He hadn't helped with the chapel search. He hadn't even stepped inside Celia's suite since the night she vanished. Instead, he'd lawyered up before the clock struck midnight. "I know what you're thinking," the detective had told June. "Tired and overworked. But people grieve differently. And there's still no crime scene here." "No crime scene?" June snapped. "You have a missing bride, her dress left behind, her phone untouched, and a fiancé who cried for the cameras before he talked to you." The detective shrugged. "It happens more often than you think. Cold feet. She might have just left." But June knew Celia. Her sister didn't run. She overplanned. She doubted. She second-guessed. But she never disappeared without a word, especially not hours before the moment she'd been building toward her entire life. That afternoon, June retraced her sister's last known steps, the hallway, the garden, the chapel's narrow path that led behind the bell tower, where the altar flowers had been stored in the shade. There, nestled in the ivy, she saw it, a heel, nude satin, mud-stained size 6.5. Celia's. She picked it up with shaking hands and turned it over. No blood, no obvious damage. Just that it had been left deliberately or not behind the place where the wedding was meant to begin. She brought it to the police. They logged it, bagged it, and set it aside. No urgency. No sirens, just a quiet nod like she'd brought in a piece of trash from the road. The story spiraled. Talk shows debated theories. Pundits argued over whether Celia had staged her own disappearance to escape a toxic marriage. Her Instagram posts were dissected. One anchor read her journal excerpts on air without permission. The word "unhinged" trended with her name. Then the rumors started. People claimed to have seen her at a gas station in Colorado. A waitress in Tennessee insisted she'd served Celia eggs and toast 2 days after the wedding. None of it was confirmed. All of it distracted from the truth. June spiraled in a different way. She stopped sleeping. She stopped answering friends. She kept Celia's room untouched. As if her sister might walk back through the door any minute, she wrote letters no one would read. To the sheriff, to the governor, to the news stations who called Celia unstable with polished smiles. She wrote one to Aaron too. "You took something from this world, and one day the world will take it back from you." She never sent it, but she kept it on her desk, where the ink smudged every time her tears fell on the paper. 2 weeks after the disappearance, the police formally ended the active investigation. "Insufficient evidence of foul play," the report read. They called it a personal choice, a bride who changed her mind, a woman overwhelmed. Nothing criminal. They never explained why her shoe was in the garden, why there were scratches on the doorframe of the chapel basement, why the florist's testimony was buried in an unfiled statement. No charges, no searches, no justice, just silence. And Aaron, he left Larkspur Hollow, quietly, with a moving truck. And a black duffel bag, He claimed it was too painful to stay. That the town was a graveyard of memories. That he needed time to heal. But he didn't leave until after he visited the chapel one last time. Martin Shaw saw him. He went into the vestibule, Martin told June, months later. Alone, stayed there for nearly an hour. Then walked out. Like nothing happened. What was he doing? She asked. Martin had looked away. Sometimes people go to say goodbye. Sometimes they go to make sure their secrets are still buried. 8 years would pass before the earth itself would scream the truth, before storms cracked open the walls that had listened quietly that night. Before time itself became a witness, but for now, all June had was a shoe, a journal, a chapel, and a name she whispered into the wind every time she stood where the aisle met the altar. Celia. 8 months had passed since Celia vanished, and still, the world spun on like nothing had happened. The wedding flowers wilted. The chapel bookings resumed. The news cycle moved on. Celia's face was no longer in the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher scandals, but June had not moved on. She kept the heel in a glass box on her desk. The journal in a drawer she opened every night. The last voicemail Celia ever left her, just a faint breath and a click, remained saved on her phone, untouched, unreplayed. Too haunting to hear again. Too sacred to delete. Spring returned to Larkspur Hollow, and with it, a fragile layer of forgetfulness. Until the first envelope arrived. It came without a stamp, no return address, no postmark, just her name scrawled in looping ink, colon June. Inside. A single page, handwritten. I can't breathe when he's near me. Not because I'm scared, because I don't know who he is anymore. I love him. I hate him. And I think he might kill me. June sat frozen, the letter trembling in her hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. Celia, she'd memorized every curve of her sister's letters over years of birthday cards, grocery lists, and notes. On the fridge, it wasn't a copy. It wasn't fake. It was real. She ran to the police that same day, her heart pounding. The detective glanced at the page and sighed. You sure it's authentic? Yes, June snapped. I know her handwriting. Like I know my own. He examined it with latex gloves. No date, no envelope, no fingerprints but yours. Could have been planted. June leaned over the table. Planted by who? The woman who's been missing for nearly a year? He said nothing? Just placed the letter in an evidence bag and labeled it without urgency. That night, June didn't sleep. She turned on every light in the apartment, afraid she'd miss something in the shadows. She stared at the letter, reading it over and over, searching for a code, a pattern, anything Celia might have hidden between the lines. 3 days later, the second letter came. This time it was folded neatly inside her mailbox. Same handwriting. Same no postmark envelope. He said I'd never leave the chapel alive. That if I tried, I'd disappear into the walls and no one would ever find me. And the worst part is, I believed him. June sat on the floor for hours holding the page like it might break in her hands. This wasn't a prank. This was a confession, a warning, a timeline. She rushed to the police again. This time they took her more seriously. The same detective brought in a handwriting expert who confirmed with 90% certainty that the writing matched previous samples of Celia's. A cold case analyst was assigned. The local media picked up the story again. Bride's sister claims new evidence in disappearance. Aaron gave no public comment, but June saw him. He showed up outside the old chapel one morning, staring up at the steeple like it owed him something. He stayed for 2 hours. Then he left, unnoticed by everyone except Martin Shaw, the caretaker, who quietly called June. He was pacing the vestibule, Martin whispered over the phone, and talking to himself. The letters kept coming, 5 in total. Each darker than the last. One hinted at past abuse, gaslighting, threats, isolation. Another described a secret room beneath the chapel. The 5th ended with a single, chilling line. If this reaches you, it means he didn't. The town's interest reignited. The case was officially reopened. Crime scene units were sent to the chapel. Ground-penetrating radar was used on the surrounding soil. Dogs sniffed the property. Investigators crawled through the walls, but nothing. No body. No blood, no DNA. Just old bricks, water damage, and secrets no one had spoken aloud in years. 3 weeks later, the case was quietly closed again. The detective's final report concluded. Letters likely written prior to disappearance. Hidden or lost? No actionable leads at this time. June felt something in her chest collapse. She had brought them a voice from the grave, and they'd called it hearsay. That night she walked to the chapel herself. Rain was falling lightly, misting the air. The trees whispered. The broken glass from a storm-shattered window still lay undisturbed near the side entrance. She stepped inside. The pews were warped from time. Mold clawed up the walls. The altar flowers were long dead, their dried petals scattered like ashes. She stood in the center aisle alone and whispered her sister's name. Celia! Her voice echoed through the empty hall. From the corner of her eye she saw it faint, almost invisible, a flicker of movement in the mirror mounted above the vestibule bench. But when she turned, there was nothing. She stepped closer. The mirror was cracked diagonally like it had been struck by a fist years ago and never repaired. In the fractured reflection, June didn't see herself. She saw the chapel walls behind her, and something shifting in them like they were breathing. Suddenly, she remembered the words from the last letter, "I disappear into the walls." June backed away slowly. Her heart pounded in her ears. She pulled out her phone and took a photo of the mirror. The flash lit up something behind the cracks too fast to make out, but not part of the architecture. She didn't know it then, but the next time she returned, the storm would change everything. The storm came without mercy. Thick clouds clouded the sky, rolling in like judgment long delayed. In the sleepy countryside where the Wren Calloway wedding had once captured fleeting headlines, lightning forked across the heavens like cracks in time. Rain fell sideways, slashing against the earth, tearing branches from trees and flooding roads until the chapel on Holleridge Hill stood alone, silent, broken, forgotten. No one visited the chapel anymore. It had been deconsecrated 3 years. After Celia's disappearance, gossip had done what the police would not, convicted the place of unholy silence. Some said it was cursed. Others said it had simply grown too heavy with secrets. Amos Bell, a groundskeeper in his 70s with weathered hands and a bad knee, had maintained the grounds for nearly 4 decades. He trimmed the rose hedges before Celia's wedding, whistled to himself while watching the bridal party arrive. He remembered the color of her gown, white, but with a blue-gray undertone like a storm cloud before it split. She smiled, but her eyes, he'd once said, looked like someone about to say goodbye. Now, as wind howled through cracked stained glass windows and hail pelted the chapel's roof, Amos stood at the edge of the property, his flashlight trembling in hand. Lightning had struck the steeple minutes ago. The blast had shaken the hilltop like a cannonball. He had come only to see the damage. Assuming a loose gutter or shattered pane, what he found was far worse. The chapel's wooden doors hung crooked, as if pushed open by unseen hands. Inside, debris littered the aisle. Pew ends had splintered. Plaster curled from the ceiling. Water pooled in shallow hollows beneath the altar. But it was the eastern wall that stopped him cold. Chunks of stone had fallen. The cross above the altar had cracked straight down the middle, exposing a cavity behind the wall that no blueprint had ever mentioned. Amos approached slowly, breath held. His boots made hollow sloshes in the puddles. The hole gaped like an unhealed wound. Inside, something was tucked into the recessa bundle, wrapped in aged white lace. His flashlight flickered. The rain thundered harder. He reached in. It was light. Too light. Fingers trembling, he peeled back the lace, once delicate, now stiff. With age, beneath it lay the remnants of a bouquet, dry roses, baby's breath, and then something else, a fragment of cloth, a swatch of silk. A single gold-threaded bead, like those on Celia Wren's custom-made wedding gown. Amos staggered backward. The beam of his flashlight bounced wildly along the floor. He fumbled for his phone, dialed emergency services with a breathless urgency. He hadn't felt in years. Behind the altar, he kept saying. There's something behind the altar. I don't know what it means, but I think it's her. Within the hour, police cars lined the muddy road. Flashing lights cut through the dark like a pulsing wound. Officers combed through the ruins while forensic teams cordoned off the altar. June Wren was called before sunrise. She hadn't set foot in Holleridge since the week after her sister vanished. She had tried once on the 5th anniversary, but her knees gave out at the chapel gate. Now, nearly a decade later, she stood again beneath the broken steeple, hands gloved, heart hollowed out. The detective leading the renewed investigation, Inspector Hartley, met her at the site. It was hidden well, he admitted, pointing to the compartment, no records of its construction. Whoever sealed it didn't want it found. June stepped closer, the smell of wet earth and mildew thick in the air. A plastic evidence bag lay open on a nearby table. Inside were the wilted roses, the lace, and something new, an embroidered name tag half ripped from fabric. The remaining letters read, ... Dia W. Her breath caught. It's hers, she whispered. They searched the cavity further and found more small, scattered objects, a broken hairpin, a crumbled note, water-stained and torn, no bones, no body, but enough to raise every ghost that had ever walked those chapel halls. The next morning, the media descended like vultures. New clues in decade-old bridal disappearance scrolled across news tickers. Aaron Calloway, now remarried and living 3 states away, refused interviews. Online forums exploded with renewed theories, cult involvement, secret lover, fake, death, but to June it didn't matter what they said. She knew what the chapel had always been, a prison. A mausoleum? A lie. She returned later that evening, after the police had cleared out, holding Celia's old journal tight against her chest. The skies had cleared, but the air smelled of aftermath. A kind of hollow stillness that felt like reverence or warning. She walked to the altar alone. The compartment had been resealed with caution tape. June sat on the nearest pew, eyes fixed on the cracked cross above. She was trying to tell me, she murmured aloud. All those dreams, all those notes, the chapel. It wasn't just a place, it was part of it. Outside, the last of the storm clouds slipped away. But in June's heart, something had just begun stirring again, something colder than fear. And deeper than memory. Celia had never left that chapel, and someone had made sure of it. The chapel was cordoned off in the pale morning light. Yellow tape flapped violently in the lingering storm winds. As investigators in plastic suits combed through the crumbled altar wall, June stood a few feet away, unable to cross the threshold. Her fingers trembled around the crucifix she hadn't worn in years. Detective Harper approached her quietly. "We believe it's her?" he said, voice low. "The dress? It matches the one described in the report from 8 years ago. The lace, the beading. We found a hair comb engraved with the initials CW." June turned her face away. She had imagined this moment countless times, finding her sister, rescuing her, bringing her home. But she had never prepared herself for this, a body behind a wall, wrapped in her bridal gown like a grotesque relic sealed in time inside the chapel. The air was thick with dust, mildew, and something sour years of decay trapped in stone. The skeletal remains lay cradled in remnants of lace and chiffon. The dress had yellowed. The veil had fused with the bones. Celia had been entombed standing upright, her arms crossed over her chest. There was no space inside the compartment for movement, no way to sit or scream or even breathe for long. Someone had built it that way on purpose. June's knees buckled when she saw the remains. A paramedic caught her before she collapsed. "No cameras," she rasped to the reporters behind. The barrier. "Not like this. Don't show her like this." By that evening, the news had gone global. Runaway bride found after 8 years murder suspected. Forensics dated the time of death to within 24 hours of Celia's disappearance. She hadn't run. She hadn't vanished on her own terms. She had been murdered, hidden behind a wall no blueprint ever acknowledged. That night, June sat in her sister's old bedroom, the one their parents never touched. Everything was preserved, the childhood drawings, the glow in the dark stars on the ceiling, the perfume bottle still half full. She found the journal again, its pages warped by age and tears. One entry stood out now with terrifying clarity. Dreamed I was trapped inside the wall, but I could hear the wedding music playing outside. I screamed and screamed. No one came. June could barely sleep. At 2:17 a.m., she received a text from an unknown number. You were right. She didn't leave. He made sure she couldn't. She stared at the words, heart pounding. She didn't respond, but she called Detective Harper immediately. When he arrived the next morning, June showed him the phone. Harper studied the message, frowning. Do you recognize the number? No, could be a prank, but the wording matches something we saw in one of Celia's letters. The phrase, he made sure she couldn't, almost verbatim. Harper promised to trace the number. But something else was already weighing on June's mind. Aaron, she said, he's been gone. Since the remains were found, he hasn't made a statement. No press, nothing. He left the state 3 years ago. Bought a cabin near Big Timber, Montana, quiet, off-grid. No social media, no visitors. June's stomach turned. You knew where he was? Harper gave a reluctant nod. He was never charged. But yes, we kept an eye on him. That evening, June opened her laptop and stared at the only photo she still had of her and Aaron together. A group shot from high school. He had his arm around Celia, but his eyes, they were fixed on June. That night, Harper called with new information. The wall, he said, voice tense. It was sealed with an old technique. Stone, plaster, then drywall to match the surrounding altar. We found tool marks consistent, with someone working from outside the chapel interior, probably at night during renovations. It had to be someone with access, June whispered. Someone like Aaron. We don't have the evidence yet, but the compartment was custom built. This wasn't a spontaneous crime, it was methodical. And the text? Rooted through a burner, but we're working on it. The next day, June drove to the chapel alone. It had been temporarily reopened for controlled public visits, memorials, vigils, media tours, but she didn't come for closure. She came for something else. Inside, the air was different, not lighter, not darker, just ... The sun filtered through the broken stained glass window. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts of light. She walked slowly toward the altar. Her footsteps echoed on the stone. She knelt and pressed her palm against the cold floorboards that once framed Celia's prison. I found you, she whispered, and I will find him. She didn't know if the chapel still held ghosts, but she felt her sister's presence, soft, sorrowful, grateful, on her way out. She passed a laminated flyer nailed to the chapel gate. Someone had added a small Polaroid to it of Celia in her gown, laughing. Scribbled in black pen underneath were the words, "She should have had her day." That night, the burner phone number texted again. "You want the truth? Meet me where it ended? Come alone." June stared at the message for a long time. Her fingers hovered over the reply. Then she texted back, "Name the place." The old pastor sat hunched on the edge of a hospital bed, his knotted hands trembling as they clasped a wooden crucifix. Rain tapped faintly against the window pane behind him, echoing a confession that had waited years to be spoken aloud. His name was Reverend Malcolm Pierce, known by locals as a gentleman, devoted, fading slowly into obscurity after decades of quiet service. But now, with a nurse just outside the door and June standing frozen at the foot of his bed, the weight of the truth pressed on his chest like a final sacrament. "I didn't want to believe what I saw," he whispered. His voice was brittle, paper-thin. It was the night before the wedding, just past midnight. I had forgotten my sermon notes in the vestry, and that's when I saw them. June didn't move. She stood still as stone, her arms crossed tightly. Against her chest, clenching Celia's old diary in one hand like a talisman. "Aaron?" she said quietly. The pastor nodded, eyes lowered. He had her by the arm. Not roughly, but ... forcefully, like a man trying to keep control. And Celia? She was crying. Not hysterically, more ... and whispering something I couldn't make out. I remember she tried to pull away, but he gripped her tighter. I heard her say, "You said it would stop." That's when I should have stepped in. June's throat tightened, But you didn't. No, he admitted, ashamed. I thought it was a lover's quarrel, that nerves were fraying. He saw me, nodded curtly, and said it was a private matter. Told me she just needed to calm down. I turned around. I walked away. June's voice cracked. You walked away when... She needed someone. The pastor's eyes welled. You don't understand the pressure. The Calloway name meant something in this town. They were generous benefactors. Aaron's father practically rebuilt the south wing of the chapel. And Celia. She didn't cry out. She didn't ask for help. She just looked at me. That look, I see it every time I close my eyes. There was a long pause. She trusted you, June finally said. She did, he murmured. And I failed her. June moved closer, placing Celia's diary on the small tray table. Tell me everything, Reverend, please. He took a breath. That rattled deep in his chest. The morning of the wedding, I was asked to retrieve something from the altar room. When I entered, Aaron was already there. He said Celia had run off in a panic but would be back soon. That she was just ... overwhelmed. But I knew something was off. The bridal suite was in chaos veil on the floor, her shoe in the garden ... June's eyes flashed. You knew then she didn't leave on her own. Yes, he said, barely audible. Later that day, Aaron came to me with a request. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that Celia had left angry, but would return. He asked for my help sealing the back compartment behind the altar. He said it had been a storage space once used for relics, and he didn't want anyone poking around. Reporters had already begun arriving. He offered a donation. I didn't ask questions. I just helped him place the panel and secure it. You never wondered what you were sealing? June asked. I tried not to, he admitted. Denial is a powerful thing, child. I convinced myself it was tools, broken kneelers, anything but what I feared. Then, as the years passed, I told myself if she'd really been harmed, something would have come to light, but nothing ever did. I thought I was protecting the church from scandal, but I was protecting a lie. June turned toward the door but paused. Why now? I saw the news, he said. The storm? The lightning? Strike. I knew the altar would break open eventually. And I knew whatever remained inside, it was time for truth. He reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out a folded note. This was slipped under my office door 2 days after the wedding. June took it, carefully unfolding the yellowed paper. It was Celia's handwriting. If anything happens to me, tell June to follow the hymn number 187. That's where he hides the truth. And make sure the pastor sees this. June blinked. He intercepted it. Aaron must have found it before. It reached you. The pastor shook his head. No, I saw it. I read it, and I buried it beneath the pulpit rug. I couldn't face what it implied. June clenched the paper in her hand. Hymn 187? He nodded. It's titled Beneath Thy Sacred Stone. There's a verse about secrets buried in holy ground. She was begging me to look. June turned, fire now lighting her steps. You may have failed her then, but you've helped now. You've given her back her voice. The pastor closed his eyes, breathing in ragged sorrow. Pray she forgives. Me. That evening, June drove alone to the chapel. The wind carried a crisp chill as if the very air was cleansing itself of forgotten sins. She stepped through the splintered doorframe, past the scorched pews, and approached the altar. Moonlight poured through the broken rafters. Spotlighting the hollow cavity where the wall had collapsed, she knelt, pressing the crumpled note to her chest. I'm listening, Celia. Then she opened the hymnal and flipped to 187. Her eyes froze. Tucked. Between the pages was another slip of paper, this one newer, smoother, untouched by time. The ink was sharp. The handwriting wasn't Celia's. It read, You weren't supposed to find this. June backed away, heartbeat thundering. Someone else had been there. Recently. The moment June touched the engagement ring, a cold tremor traveled through her fingertips. It had been hidden in a chipped porcelain teacup behind a row of dusty hymnals on the pastor's bookshelf, an odd hiding place for something meant to symbolize eternal love. The once delicate band was marred with a faint but unmistakable smear of brown, oxidized and dried into its crevices. She didn't want to believe it was blood, not until the lab confirmed it. 2 days later, the forensic report arrived. The blood belonged to Celia. Even more damning was what they found under the engagement. Ring setting, fragments of Aaron's skin cells, wedged deep in the metal's grooves, mingled with bits of Celia's broken fingernail. It wasn't just a scuffle. It was a fight to escape. The report landed like a thunderclap across town. After 8 years of whispers, flowers left anonymously at the chapel gate, and speculative podcasts painting Celia as either a ghost or a runaway, the narrative shifted in an instant. Her death was no longer theory, it was a certified homicide. And the person who was supposed to vow to love and protect her had become the prime suspect, but Aaron was long gone. He had vanished nearly 4 years earlier. According to the last official document, a plane ticket to Lisbon, Portugal. After a flurry of public appearances and crocodile tears in the early days of the investigation, he'd retreated into silence, citing emotional fatigue. The public had moved on. But June had not. The same afternoon, the DNA results were released. June returned to the chapel not as a mourner this time, but as someone with purpose. The structure was still partially cordoned off due to fire damage, but her press credentials gave her access. She wore gloves and carried a small flashlight. Determined to look for what the police hadn't bothered with, she focused on the vestry, a room that hadn't been touched since the lightning strike 6 months ago. Rain had stained the wallpaper, with black streaks and mold blossomed along the baseboards like bruises. June moved carefully, her footsteps echoing off the warped floorboards, behind the wardrobe where choir robes once hung. She found it a loose panel in the wall, warped from moisture. She pried it open slowly. Inside, buried in decades-old dust and decay, was a cracked, leather-bound book. Celia's childhood diary. Began innocently doodles, crushes, scribbled prayers, but by the final pages, the tone had changed. One entry, from 2 weeks before the wedding, read, "He watches me sleep sometimes. I used to think it was sweet. Now I pretend not to notice. I feel like a possession. Something borrowed, waiting to be returned." Another, dated just 5 days before her disappearance. "June says I should cancel. She doesn't see what he's really like when no one's around. But I've already tried to leave once. That night he told me I'd never make it out alive if I tried again." The diary pages trembled in June's hands. She took everything to Detective Miriam Sloan, the only investigator who'd ever seemed to care. Sloane's face darkened as she read through the entries. "It's a clear pattern of coercion and escalation," she said. "We missed the signs, or maybe ... we ignored them." The case, now reclassified, surged with new energy. But Aaron remained a ghost. No credit card activity, no known relatives, and no confirmed sightings in years. Still, June wasn't ready to hand over her sister's story entirely to the system. Not again. She began mapping out everything. Timelines, known locations, journal entries, florist testimonies, chapel blueprints. It was meticulous, obsessive, but necessary. One evening, while reviewing Celia's wedding rehearsal photos, June noticed something odd in the background of a group shot, something she had never paid attention to before. There, near the chapel's vestibule, barely visible behind the stained glass shadow, was a figure in a wide-brimmed hat. The same man the florist claimed to have seen arguing with Celia the night before the wedding. The same man the pastor denied knowing. And the same man June suspected wasn't a stranger at all. She zoomed in on the photo. The image was grainy, distorted by light, but she saw a scar across his neck. A long, pale line she remembered from childhood. Because Aaron had once claimed he got it from a bicycle accident. This man wasn't a mystery. He was undisguised and lurking. The realization made her stomach churn. He had staged everything, even his appearances. He'd wanted Celia to disappear in a way that would always make people question her, not him. But why go through the ceremony? Why rehearse a wedding you never planned to complete unless the wedding wasn't for Celia, it was for everyone else? A performance? June's obsession deepened. She revisited the chapel again, this time with a contractor friend who specialized in historical buildings. "Check the foundation," she instructed him, "especially under the side aisle. The next morning he called her, breathless. "You need to come now." She rushed to the site. Her boots crunched over wet gravel as he led her to the western edge of the chapel, where the ground had sunken oddly since the storm. They had begun clearing debris, and beneath it, they found a second sealed compartment. Unlike the first, this one had no lace, no ceremony. It had chains, empty chains. They were bolted into the floor. And beside them, rusted and buried in soot, was a small, golden crucifix, the same one Celia wore the day she vanished. June turned to the contractor, her voice shaking. She wasn't just hidden. She was held? Suddenly, everything made sense. The hurried wedding, the missing security footage, the pastor's silence. Aaron hadn't just killed her. He had kept her, and maybe, just maybe, not all of her had been buried. The air inside the old chapel hung heavy, like it was holding its breath. June stood at the center of the sanctuary, staring at the stained glass window that filtered in fractured light. She could almost hear Celia's voice there, soft, unsure, always second-guessing herself. The pews were long empty, but in June's mind, they were filled with ghosts. In the days following the forensic confirmation of Aaron's DNA beneath Celia's fingernails, everything began to unravel. June had known the truth deep down, had carried it like a stone in her chest for nearly a decade. But now, facts were replacing whispers, and the image of the grieving fiancé Aaron had projected to the world was shattering under the weight of cold evidence. June met with Detective Ortega at the district station, a woman who had recently taken over cold case reviews. Ortega laid it out plainly: the blood-stained engagement ring, the DNA results, the pastor's confession. Each was a piece of a long-suppressed puzzle. "We believe Celia confronted him in this chapel, right before the ceremony," Ortega said, flipping through pages of statements. "We believe she told him she was calling it off." June nodded, though the words landed like punches. "He didn't take it well." "No," Ortega confirmed. "And we think the pastor walked in just moments after." According to the pastor's revised account, he had entered the side aisle and witnessed Aaron shaking Celia violently. When Celia struck back, he panicked. Aaron pushed her one forceful shove and she fell. Her head struck the wooden step at the base of the altar. The sound, the pastor admitted, still haunted him in his sleep. He claimed she didn't move afterward. There was blood. Not much, but enough to know it was serious. Aaron dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her, whispering her name. The pastor, paralyzed with shock, watched in silence. He told himself Aaron was just calming her. That's what he clung to for years. But now he admitted to more. "He looked up at me," the pastor had said. "And I knew he wasn't asking for help. He was demanding silence." In the hours that followed, the pastor helped Aaron wrap Celia in a ceremonial white lace covering and conceal her behind the altar wall, a space that once held forgotten hymnals and candles. They sealed it without a word. The pastor never returned to that part of the chapel again. "He told me he panicked," Ortega continued. "Said Aaron was in shock. But that doesn't explain the ring in his drawer, or why he told no one for 8 years. Because he wasn't just protecting Aaron, June thought. He was protecting the image, the illusion of sacredness, of purity, of marriage as salvation. But for Celia, marriage had been a trap. From the beginning, June had seen it. Celia's smile never reached her eyes when she talked about Aaron. Her laugh dimmed after they got engaged. There were little bruises she blamed on clumsiness, texts she deleted before June could ask. Their mother used to say, "He's just intense, that's love." But June had known better. Now the investigation officially shifted from a missing person to a homicide. The public reacted with a mix of outrage and betrayal. News anchors who had once shown clips of Aaron crying into a handkerchief at a candlelight. Vigil now revisited footage with cynical commentary. Talk shows picked apart his interviews, highlighting moments of manipulation, crocodile tears, deflection. Aaron himself, however, had vanished. He'd left town weeks before the chapel storm damage unearthed Celia's remains. His last known address was in New Mexico, and neighbors claimed he'd moved for a job. Now he wasn't answering his phone. His social media was wiped. June wasn't surprised, became obsessed with tracking him down. While police were burdened by procedure and red tape, June had one weapon they didn't relentless purpose. She found old college friends of Aaron's, former co-workers even. A wedding planner who once overheard Aaron lose his temper over floral arrangements. Every person painted a darker picture. He was controlling, one woman said. He'd call Celia 20 times a day. I saw him grab her arm hard once, said a groomsman who'd since cut ties. I remember thinking she didn't look like a bride. She looked like a hostage, whispered a bridesmaid who'd quit the bridal party days before the wedding. June compiled everything. Photos, statements, timeline inconsistencies. She submitted it all to Ortega, who promised to escalate the case. Still, June couldn't rest. Not while Aaron remained free. One evening, June found herself back in Celia's old bedroom, now filled with dusty boxes and unopened letters. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the last of the anonymous envelopes, one she had avoided. Inside was a note in Celia's handwriting, slanted, uneven, clearly written under distress. If anything happens to me, it's Aaron, it read. He told me once, you belong to me in life or death. I'm scared, June. I don't know how to leave without vanishing. June pressed the paper to her chest and sobbed, not just for Celia, but for the years she spent screaming into silence. She looked up at the ceiling, whispering, I hear you now. I promise I'm not done. The next morning, she received a tip from a woman who ran a motel just outside Tucson. She remembered Aaron, said he checked in under a different name, paid in cash, and stayed off-grid. He'd left behind something strange, a small box wrapped in velvet, containing a mirror and a torn wedding photo only. Celia's half was burned. June's breath caught in her throat. She knew then that Aaron hadn't vanished because he was afraid of being caught. He was planning something, and whatever it was, it wasn't over. The storm had passed, but the aftermath clung to the town like fog on stained glass. Tree limbs lay broken across the cemetery path. The old chapel, blackened by lightning, loomed like a wounded sentinel. It was nearly unrecognizable now, its roof caved in, pews rotted, vines clawing up its sides like they'd come to claim it for the earth. June stood before it, her arms cradling a small wooden box. Inside the box were Celia's shoes, restored, cleaned, resoled, but still unmistakably hers. White satin heels, scuffed just slightly at the tips. The left one still bore a faint scratch where it had once caught on the chapel's uneven stone floor. June remembered watching Celia try them on, months before the wedding. They pinch. Celia had laughed, but they're mine. That small moment had become sacred now, fossilized in memory. The memorial had no guests, just June. A quiet drizzle, and the memory of a sister lost in silence. She stepped carefully through the fractured threshold, her boots crunching over glass and debris. The scent of mold and wet ash filled the space. The altar, once pristine white, was now cracked open like a wound. It was where Celia had been hidden behind the old plaster wall, behind the hymns, behind the silence of a man in a collar, too. Afraid to speak, June knelt at the foot of the altar and opened the box. She removed the shoes and set them down right where Celia should have stood to say her vows. Right where she'd never made it. I brought you back, June whispered, brushing dust off one heel. Not the way I wanted, but you're home. Now, above her, sunlight pierced through a gap in the chapel's collapsed ceiling. A shaft of golden light spread across the altar like a benediction. The storm had ripped away the rot and secrecy, and in its place, truth had crept in quiet and steady as June took a mirror from her coat pocket. Celia's compact, the one she always kept in her purse. The glass was cracked, but her initials were still etched in the corner. June propped it gently on a broken hymnal, angling it toward the light. The beam caught it, scattering reflections against the chapel walls. Shimmering across water-streaked windows, it felt like a sign, or maybe it was just the sun. Either way, it broke something open inside June. I found you, Cel, she said softly. I found all the pieces, and I'm not letting them lie quiet anymore. Wind stirred through the open chapel. The vines that strangled the windows rustled like breath. The place had held its secrets for too long. June rose, stepping backward, her eyes never leaving the shoes. She felt something shift behind her, a sensation she couldn't name. Not fear, not relief. Just something beginning. The police had already exhumed what little remained. The ring, the blood. The skin beneath Celia's fingernails. All catalogued, all preserved now as evidence. The case had been reopened. Aaron had been taken in for questioning, again. But with the pastor dead, and Aaron's high-priced lawyers working overtime, the process crawled slower than grief. Still, June pressed forward. She turned from the altar and began snapping photos of the chapel's interior. Every angle, every crack, every remnant of a lie that had stood too long. Her own private record just in case the system failed her again. Outside, thunder rumbled far off, but the skies held. She exited the chapel and glanced back once more. The shoes glowed faintly in the sunlight like ghostly footprints, back home. June laid out the remaining letters, the ones the police had. Dismissed. She kept them on her kitchen table now, read them like scripture. Celia's final writings were fragmented, fearful, desperate. But one sentence still made June freeze every time. He said I'd never leave the chapel alive. She highlighted that line again, then opened her laptop. She pulled up a list she'd compiled over the last few weeks' guests from the wedding. Former florists, chapel staff, even caterers. One name stood out now, Derek Slona Jr., event manager from the chapel's booking agency. He had vanished. Shortly after the wedding, quit his job. Moved out of town. Left no forwarding address, and June had just found a mailing address linked to his last paycheck stub. A house upstate, by a lake. She grabbed her keys. The drive was long, cutting through winding hills and flooded pastures. Her tires hissed over wet roads, and the windshield wipers kept time like a slow metronome. She hadn't told anyone she was doing this. Not the police. Not even her therapist. Some part of her knew that chasing ghosts came with consequences, but so did silence. The house was small and remote, tucked between overgrown trees. The lake behind it shimmered gray under the overcast sky. June parked by the rusting mailbox and walked up the gravel path. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knocked twice. Nothing. She knocked again. Louder. The door creaked open an inch. A man's voice, weathered and cautious, called out, "Who's there?" "June Mathers," she replied. "Celia's sister." Silence. "I just want to talk," she added. "No police, not yet." The door opened fully. The man who stood there was gaunt, eyes ringed with shadows, hair graying at the temples. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in years. But his eyes recognized her instantly. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. "If they know you're asking questions." "Then maybe it's time they knew." June cut in. "You saw something that day?" "I think you've been carrying it ever since." He hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the house was cluttered, dimly lit, boxes stacked high with wedding programs, invoices, guest lists. Derek moved like a man haunted. He poured them both coffee but didn't drink his. "I was in the vestibule," he said after a long pause, "right before the ceremony. I saw Aaron storm off with her. I saw her heel break. I saw the panic in her eyes. Why didn't you say anything?" June asked, voice shaking. "I was told not to," he said, eyes darting. "By someone higher up. Someone who told me the chapel couldn't afford another scandal." "Who?" June pressed. He looked down. "A woman? Dark hair?" "Always wore a navy blue coat. She ran the venue back then." "Margaret Dorset." June wrote the name down. I didn't know she'd end up," he broke off. "By the time I realized how bad it was too late. And when the footage vanished, I knew it wasn't an accident." "The security footage?" June asked. He nodded. "Cameras caught everything, but someone wiped it clean." A gust of wind slammed against the window, making them both jump. "I kept quiet for too long," Derek said, finally looking her in the eye. "But if you're willing to keep pushing, I'll testify." Back in her car, June's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. Margaret Dorset. That name hadn't come up before. The woman who ran the chapel, woman who might have orchestrated a cover-up, and possibly more. The final chapter wasn't written yet, but June could feel it approaching. Like a storm circling back around, she reached into her pocket and pulled out Celia's mirror. The sunlight hit it through the windshield, sending a single gleam across the dashboard. "Stormlight," June whispered. Then she started the car and turned down the hill toward Margaret. The sky was still dripping when June returned to the chapel the next morning. Mist clung to the gravestones like faded memories, the scent of wet earth rising from the ground. She carried with her a simple object, a mirror the size of a paperback book, framed in white birch bark. It had belonged to Celia. She'd kept it in her childhood bedroom, etched with the phrase, "To see yourself is not to know yourself." June hiked alone to the clearing behind the chapel, the same one where a heel had been found nearly a decade ago. The trees there had grown denser over the years, thick vines twisting like veins over forgotten soil. She found a low-hanging branch, and with trembling hands, tied the mirror to it with a length of white lace dot as it dangled gently in the breeze. It caught the weak sunlight, flashing once then again like a signal. June stepped back, letting the moment settle. It wasn't just about finding Celia anymore. It was about honoring her, reclaiming what had been stolen. A drone's distant hum rose in the sky. A local news crew, following up on the reopened case, was surveying the site from above. June watched as the drone tilted toward the glinting mirror and hovered. One of the crew called down from the ridge, "It's catching the sun! Beautiful shot!" She offered a nod but said nothing. What could be spoken now that hadn't already been carved into silence? The next day, the footage aired across regional news stations, a drone's eye view of the ruined chapel, the sun breaking through clouds, and the lone mirror swaying like a heartbeat in the trees. It was poetic, unintentional, but meaningful. Comments flooded in. Who left the mirror? Was this part of a vigil? Symbolic justice? The internet did what it always did, grabbed the story and ran. But for June, this wasn't viral. This was sacred. This was the last mile of a road she had walked far too long. 3 days later, she stood before the courthouse as Aaron was arraigned, older now, grayer, his once perfect posture bent under shame and disbelief. June felt nothing for him. No rage, no fear. Just clarity. As the charges were read second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with a corpse. He barely flinched. His lawyer advised silence, but Aaron turned to June once, briefly, eyes hollowed by the weight of years. Whatever he wanted to say evaporated before it could reach his lips. Outside, reporters swarmed, but June walked through them like mist. She had no comment, no soundbite. Her justice had already been spoken in the mirror's reflection. Back home, June revisited the box of letters, the ones Celia had written but never sent. She laid them across her bed like puzzle pieces. Each bore the same pain, the same cryptic terror. But now, with truth in hand, June read them with new eyes. One letter, dated just 3 days before the wedding, caught her breath. He doesn't know about the cottage. I'll go there if I can make it out. June, if I vanish, look there. First, you'll understand. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in fear or haste. The cottage. It was a place their grandparents once owned in the mountains, now long abandoned. They hadn't spoken of it in years. It was Celia's secret fallback, a plan B she never reached, or did she? The following weekend, June drove north. The mountains rose like sentinels, mist curling around their peaks. The road to the cottage was almost completely overtaken by foliage, but she pressed on, tires crunching over gravel and roots. The structure stood like a fossil roof, sagging, windows cracked, ivy crawling up the sides. She stepped inside cautiously, flashlight cutting through dust motes. Then she saw it on the fireplace mantel, a photo of her and Celia as kids, arms linked, covered in lake water and laughter. June gasped. Someone had come here. In the far corner, a pile of notebooks lay beneath a tarp. They were weathered but intact. She opened one, more writing, Celia's handwriting. If I survive, if I breathe past the altar, this is my sanctuary. This is where I will begin again. Tears fell freely now. Celia had made it here once, maybe only briefly. Maybe she'd hidden her hopes here, praying someone would one day listen closely enough to find them. June read for hours, each word a resurrection. The final entry was dated the morning of the wedding. It ended mid-sentence. Back in town, June submitted the journals to the investigators. Though they couldn't alter the timeline or reverse the tragedy, they added context, motive, and intent. More importantly, they painted Celia not as a runaway, not as a victim of chance, but a woman fighting to live, and to leave. June decided to compile the letters and journal entries into a private memoir, something to hold for herself, and maybe someday share with others. The title would be simple: The Light She Left Behind. The chapel was demolished a month later. Too many bad memories, too much decay. June requested one brick from the altar wall. She placed it in her garden. Among lavender and Celia's favorites, she also planted a single white vine along the edge, one that would crawl and bloom quietly. Year after year. In the spring, the garden flourished. In the summer, a butterfly landed on the altar brick, and one autumn evening, as June watched the sunset flicker across her sister's mirror in the tree outside her window, she smiled, not in joy, but in deep, hard-won peace, because even when justice feels late, even when truth hides behind stone and silence, light somehow still finds its way through.